Welcome to the fourth Roundtable on Investment and Sustainable Development. This year, the topic is FDI Qualities, Aligning the Investment Framework for Green Growth. I would like to extend warm welcome to Undersecretary Jose Fernandez and Minister Felix Mutati. Thank you for taking the time and to deliver the keynote address for this important event. This roundtable is an important platform for the investment community at the OECD to contribute to the OECD effort in advancing the Sustainable Development Goal. Without further delay, let us listen to the opening remark of the OECD Secretary General, Matthias Cormann, who would like to be here, but for previous commitment at the COP26, he offered a video statement. Please let's put the video statement and then we will start with our keynote speech.
Minister, Undersecretary, delegates, distinguished colleagues. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the fourth OECD Roundtable on Investment and Sustainable Development. With COP26 now underway, this year's Roundtable focuses on the critical role of private investment, in particular international investment, in helping us reach global net zero emissions by 2050. Foreign direct investment will have to contribute to the decarbonisation of our economies and help deliver stronger, cleaner and fairer growth. Foreign direct investment is a driving force behind many countries' efforts to expand their renewable energy generation capacity, accounting for a third of new investments globally in renewables in 2020. Truly realizing its full potential is not a given though. While green investment continues to grow globally, we continue to face a significant funding gap. An estimated $4 trillion US of public and private investment will need to be mobilized every year to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The annual funding gap for developing countries is increasing year on year, up to an estimated $3.7 trillion US in 2020. The OECD Foreign Direct Investment Qualities Project is designed to help. The Foreign Direct Investment Qualities Policy Toolkit, which we endeavor to deliver at the 2022 OECD Ministerial Council meeting, will support governments in targeting and improving the impact of foreign direct investment on sustainable development in their economies and across societies more generally, including to achieve decarbonisation and green growth. This work is based on the principles of open, transparent and non-discriminatory investment policies as advocated by the OECD Policy Framework for Investment. The Foreign Direct Investment Qualities Toolkit is part of a whole of OECD approach to supporting countries' progress on the path towards net zero emissions. The OECD's contribution to global efforts to address climate change also includes our international program for action on climate, the Green Recovery Database, and our proposal to establish an inclusive framework on explicit and implicit carbon pricing. Our work on foreign direct investment qualities is also closely aligned with our initiative to support coherent and consistent reporting and regulatory frameworks for sustainable finance. We need to fully leverage financial markets in the climate transition and to develop the right data, metrics, and analytical tools for financial market participants to better measure and manage climate transition, in particular in the context of work on environmental, social, and governance investing. The OECD will advance a policy framework to integrate environmental, social, and governance factors to include definitions, principles, and due diligence guidance for sustainable finance, including climate transition finance. These and many other initiatives, including as part of the G20 and G7 agendas, such as our contribution on SDG alignment of private finance, are designed to help governments with the challenge of turning ambitious climate commitments into real action and real outcomes. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay, let me now turn to United States. Undersecretary for Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy and the Environment, Jose Fernandez, once again, thank you for joining us today. We would like to ask you in your keynote speech, how is the U.S. promoting the agenda of alignment investment framework to support green growth and reduce carbon emission? What are the main priorities going forward? Undersecretary, the floor is yours, and thanks again for being with us.
Joanna, it's a privilege. It's a privilege and it's a real delight to join this year's OECD Roundtable on Investment and Sustainable Development, especially at this historic juncture in the global approach to climate change. As our colleagues in Glasgow work to set a roadmap towards net zero emissions by 2050, I'm delighted to discuss with you how competitive investment policies can secure the finance needed to meet the goals being set. To enact the ambitious agenda before us, some $7 trillion a year is needed. We need to meet head-on the economic, physical infrastructure, and social effects presented by the climate challenge. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Growing numbers of people are adversely affected annually by climate change, and no country is spared, as we've learned here in the US. And what this means is that every year, governments spend valuable resources simply coping with disasters, preventing meaningful investment to avert future disasters. Climate change lengthens the race that we've been running to achieve sustainable development goals. According to the International Energy Agency, to achieve net zero clean energy technologies will require that we meet at least two objectives. First, we need to ramp up the annual installation of renewable energy capacity from wind and solar by 4 times from what it is today. For solar, this is actually the equivalent to installing the world's largest solar park every day for the next decade. And secondly, we need 60% of vehicle sales around the world to be electric vehicles by 2030, coupled with a buildup of charging stations powered by clean energy. But other efforts will also be needed. We will have to look, for example, at how new technologies can be developed to improve our cities, because while cities are large drivers of economic growth, they also produce some 70% of global carbon emissions. The bulk of these emissions come from the transport and electricity sectors, which means that we have to rethink how we provide the basic services that we need. But all the money in the world won't be enough if prudent investors fail to find credible investment climates. We can't expect private capital to support projects that are otherwise bankable if fair, transparent, and predictable regulatory frameworks do not exist. Such frameworks, in turn, rely on policymakers at the municipal, provincial, and national levels to create the investment climate that will support green investments. Let's keep in mind that governments all around the world are already competing to attract foreign direct investment. They launch roadshows, legislatures grant tax concessions, governments seek to educate their workforce with work skills that can be employed up the value chain. But in addition to all that, we need attractive business climates to entice green investments, and that's what I'd like to talk about next. In the US, for example, we're now redoubling our efforts to increase transparency and to de-risk green projects. For example, the Blue Dot Network, BDN, is one initiative that we've spearheaded, and the OECD has been a great partner in this effort. An OECD report from this past June highlighted that firms are not participating in infrastructure projects largely because of inadequate risk-return profiles and a lack of trust in host governments. So together with Australia and with Japan, and with the technical support from your group at the OECD, we're now pushing ahead with a mechanism to certify quality infrastructure projects with procurement processes that are open and transparent, and building technologies that are environmentally and socially sustainable and that take into account the long-term costs of projects. This is something that really hasn't been done often enough in the past. This will not only allow our companies to compete in a race to the top, but it will also benefit the host countries by adhering to the highest labor, environmental, and quality standards around the world. Together with our G7 partners, we've also announced the Build Back Better World, which in Washington speak goes by B B3W, our B3W initiative to address the infrastructure financing gap faced by the developing world by mobilizing private sector capital for sustainable infrastructure. All of these projects can help attract green bonds, which, as you know, are growing exponentially. Global bond markets, for example, were worth about $93 trillion, $93 trillion in 2010. Of this, green bonds comprised only $4 billion. But by 2021, this number has grown exponentially to more than $375 billion. The development banks are leading the way, but corporations, energy utilities, and other agencies have come on board. And more than half of green bonds now are issued by private corporations. But even the US Federal Mortgage Association, or Fannie Mae, which along with its sibling company Freddie Mac owns more than 60% of all US home mortgages and supports affordable housing here in the US, even they have gotten into the act. Fannie Mae has issued green bonds totaling more than $95 billion since 2012. That makes it the single largest issuer of green bonds in the entire world. And the US Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, has significantly upped its climate ambition. It's committed to have a third of all projects be climate aligned from next year and to net zero portfolio emissions by 2040. Governments that are looking to attract investment also have to focus on improving information to the market. And we've also been working on this. Our Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, is currently drafting new climate disclosure rules, and our Treasury Department, which is the chair of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, has just issued a set of recommendations to position climate-related financial risks as a central part of financial stability work. These recommendations include work to understand, to assess, and to mitigate climate-related financial risk and to promote consistent, comparable, and decision-useful disclosures. And I served as Assistant Secretary for the Department of State from 2009 to 2013, but the rest of my professional life has been spent in the private sector. I know the challenges of an inhospitable investment climate, and let me just suggest that this roundtable going forward address at least 3 challenges to investment in the developing world. The first one is transparency. We know that investors avoid uncertainty. We know that the more a government can consult with industry publicly, both before and after enacting investment rules, the more that investors will appreciate it. The challenge, of course, is as you do those consultations, is to avoid perceptions of favoritism during those consultations. But nevertheless, governments have to find a way to keep communications flowing to investors. Second, all government entities have to be reading from the same script. This may seem logical to you, but we routinely monitor some 200 or so investment disputes around the world, and a significant portion of those disputes involve some sort of sub-federal agent, sub-national agency. Often they could be local permitting and zoning offices that have somehow tripped things up, sometimes without the national governments knowing about it. This is a problem not just in the developing world, but also in the US. But when capitals communicate broadly throughout all levels of government, more FDI can be incentivized to enter the market. And that's because we need an open, predictable, and fair investment climate. The third challenge that I'd like to point out is maintaining flexibility. Climate change mitigation efforts are rapidly evolving. We see this in how feed-in tariffs are adjusted, how public sentiment is changing about nuclear or natural gas, or how new transport options are meeting new market forces. So when drafting regulations, when drafting rules, governments need to be smart. They need to be smart by building in sufficient policy space while preserving as much legal certainty as possible. Technologies that leapfrog also require regulatory processes to remain nimble. We have to zero in on essential elements to preserve policy with a light touch, because no one is benefited if we are too prescriptive, if we do it in the spirit of providing certainty to investors, but then we have to reverse course because calculations change midstream in the project. These three fundamentals have now become far more urgent. In Glasgow, countries today are pledging funds and technology to assist governments to move away from coal-fired power. But when investors start knocking on doors in the coming months, when they decide to actually put their money in the projects, we will need to find jurisdictions with land titling procedures in order, where judicial procedures for eminent domain are well defined, where intellectual property right laws are well enforced, and where permitting processes are clarified. All of this as economies retool and require land for solar farms, rights of way for new transmission lines, or legal flexibility for new technologies that we can't even imagine. So this is where today's session comes in. Over the decades, you and the OECD have brought together industry leaders and policymakers to find consensus on the essential levers to attract FDI, with many high-quality codes and best practices that reflect non-discrimination, transparency, and responsible business conduct. The latest effort in this proud tradition is the FDI Qualities Policy Toolkit. I look forward to hearing how this toolkit will build on other instruments to identify policies that could help us move to net zero. As an ambitious roadmap is being set in Glasgow, our efforts here will help governments make necessary adjustments to regulatory framework that will make this green transformation a reality. Our mission is daunting, but we're making progress. Already 80% of newly installed energy last year was clean energy. Over 50 cities, including 7 in the US, are on track to meet their Paris targets. So let's make sure that a welcoming investment climate waits to soak up the green financing that is about to rain down. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing this conversation.
Thanks a lot, Undersecretary Fernandez. A very good keynote to frame the discussion that we will have here, and thanks for identifying the main challenges that you feel that we will have. We understand that you have another commitment very soon, but please feel free to leave whenever you need to leave. And now let's go with the Minister of Science and Technology of Zambia, Felix Mutati. Thanks also to you for being with us. We would like to ask you in your keynote speech, how is Zambia leveraging foreign direct investment in support of green growth and reduce carbon emission? And what are the main priorities for you going forward? Minister, the floor is yours. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thanks a lot. No, good afternoon, and I'm grateful to have me, this afternoon. My name, like you said, I'm Felix Mutati, Minister of Technology and Science of Zambia. In my journey in politics in 2010, 2011, I was a Minister of Commerce and Industry in Zambia. At that time in 2010, 2011, we did our investment policy review. We were the first in Southern Africa, in the sub-Saharan African to undertake, the policy review under the theme of unlocking investment potential in Southern Africa. This was sponsored by Finland and other cooperating partners. Now, what was the focus at that time? The focus was a number of issues that were confronting us at the time. Was the investment policy. Number 2 was investment promotion and facilitation. 3 is trade and competition policy, and tax policy, and infrastructure, development. Now, 10 years later, the country has been under significant stress arising out of unsustainable debt position that we find ourselves in. One problem. The second problem confronting us is that the reforms that we had agreed to undertake in 2010, 2011 have remained slow in implementation. So you could roughly say we are more or less at the same level we were in 2010, 2011. And therefore, our problem as Zambia is quite significant. So moving forward, we are basically a good candidate on how we can be able to attract foreign direct investment to finance green energy in Zambia. What we need to do is quite clear. We need to increase access to renewable energy and grid accessibility. In order to get there, we are undertaking what we're calling the cost of service study. It is a study that is going to give us the tariff structure for all the participants in the energy sector. We are also undertaking a review of the legal framework with the associated regulations to ensure that the legal framework motivates investment on one hand, on the other hand, it facilitates for competition in the sector. What has happened in the last 10 years is that because the legal framework and the regulatory framework has been not so clear, we have had very limited investment in green energy. And because we have had one predominant public utility that procures power from all suppliers and determines the price at which you are going to sell, that has created a barrier of entry in terms of foreign direct investment. Now, we are a new government that was elected only this year, 12th of August, and we have been in government for a very short period. So we are grappling with a number of issues in terms of how we create an investment climate that attracts investment, particularly in energy. Now, when we worked with the OECD at that time, a lot more emphasis was placed on issues around assessment of what are the issues that we are grappling with. I think what we need as Zambia for now and going forward is one, institutional capacity building. That is critically important. Number two, our space to borrow for investment, even in energy, is non-existent. Three, we need a legal framework and a regulatory framework that is going to support investment in the sector. And more so, clarity in terms of the feed-in tariff, which is required to motivate investment. One of the things that we have learned is that a number of the investors, as they come in, they are looking for what is called government guarantees. Now, with a weak government balance sheet, that guarantee is certainly not that much worthwhile. So priority for us is institutional capacity building, because we're at the point when we need to reconstruct ourselves and create a platform that can land investment in energy, particularly in green energy. Everything else around land regulation, that is pretty okay. Under judicial system, that is pretty okay. And talking from a technology perspective, we are also wanting to use technology as a mechanism to drive economic transformation. But in order to do that, again, you get back to an enabling environment, which is your legal framework and regulation that requires to be done. So if there was a candidate that you'd want to put as one that you'd want to clean up, clean enough to land foreign direct investment, create capacity, Zambia is that candidate. And that's the reason I wanted to participate, to be able to say that we are ready for a good wash from OECD. We're a new government under 3 months, in power. And I can tell you, it's not an easy matter. We are having challenges from a number of directions. But what we do know is that we are equal to the task. I thank you.
Thanks, Minister. Thanks a lot for your word. My team is very happy to engage with you, and in fact, we are being engaging with you to see how we can support you in your new government. But the most important thing is that you have identified already what is needed, and I think that is aligned with what Undersecretary told us in terms of institutional setting, that is transparency, predictability, is linked with all the things that you have said. Thanks for being with us right now, and thanks for your keynotes, and looking forward to working with you. Okay, now I would like to welcome the panelists for today's session. We are lucky to count on this excellent and diverse group of panelists. We have with us Deborah Revoltella, Director, Economic Department, European Investment Bank. Chutin Kong Sak, or Sam, for those who know him. He's the Deputy Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand. Jorge Sequeira, Managing Director of CINDE, Investment Promotion Agency in Costa Rica. Brigitta Hackenstein, Senior Management for Energy and Climate Policy of the largest global chemical producer, BASF. Karsten Loeffler, Head of Frankfurt School UNEP Collaborating Center for Climate and Sustainable Energy Finance, Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. And Lisa Sachs, Director from Columbia Center of Sustainable Investment. Before I give the floor to our distinguished panelists, allow me to introduce very, very brief this session. We are starting this roundtable at the same time that diplomats, activists, and civil society politicians and business are gathering in Glasgow for the COP26. The 2015 Paris Agreement committed all parties, developed, emerging, and least developed, to limit global mean temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, preferable to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It is expected that the COP will bring a new impetus to global effort to mitigate climate change, and new and more ambitious national pledge to reduce emissions. It is very clear at this stage that the only way to keep growing is by leaving fossil fuel behind and decarbonizing our economies. There are many options to do this, and many stakeholders that must contribute. The challenge is, more than choose among options, is how to use all of the tools and resources that we have and involve all stakeholders, government, business, civil society, and academics. For this reason, are all of you invited here today. At the OECD, we have emphasized that a strong government commitment to combat climate change and to support low carbon growth, underpinned by a coherent policy framework and clear targets provided to investors, with encouraging signals regarding the government's climate ambition. Setting a clear long-term strategic framework to mainstream decarbonization that is linked to the national vision of goal for growth and development is critically important to mitigate the risk related to investment in low carbon, and new technologies to attracting foreign investment that contribute to climate agenda. In this context, the OECD investment community have been working both with the policy framework for investment and now additional with the FDI Qualities Initiative in guiding governments to create this favorable environment for investment that attract investment but also have positive impact in tackling climate change. Given the cross-cutting nature of climate change, a strategic framework for addressing it should include a comprehensive and coherent multi-stakeholder approach, multi-sectoral also approach, targeted environment and strategic plans, including investment strategic plans. Many governments are doing this effort. On July this year, the European Commission adopted a set of proposals to make the climate, energy, transport, and taxation policies fit for reducing greenhouse emission. I would like to start with our first panelist, Deborah Revoltella. But please let me remind you, the participants in this roundtable, that you can submit your questions in the chat during the panel's interventions. The panelist intervention, you can also raise your virtual hands after. But let me start with Deborah. Deborah, what are the main elements of the EU Green Deal in relation to private investment? What are the impediments that have observed for EU investors to support green growth and decarbonization, both at home and abroad? And how will the proposed EU deal with these kind of challenges? Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and it's really an honor to be part of this roundtable and to be able to actually complement to what I heard before. I think it's quite clear that the EU Green Deal has put Europe at the forefront in the global green, in terms of its global green ambitions, and the commitment to a carbon neutral continent by 2050 has been combined to the commitment to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And the combination of the two is crucial because on the one side is the long-term commitment, but also a commitment to act promptly for the short term to go into the right trajectory now. And then with the Fit for 55, it's the first example of a comprehensive package that is trying to bring into active regulation what is needed to comply with these two commitments, the carbon neutral continent and the reduction of emissions by 2030. So it's a combination of these three elements that is actually quite important, but it's the implementation of the Fit for 55 that really will regulate, will put into place all these detailed regulation that will actually create the framework for the private sector operation. And then Europe has also managed to link the green transition to the recovery process. So what came out from the political discussion in Europe was this linking, using, if you want, the excuse of the recovery support to link it to the green transition. Of course, the green transformation is a much bigger project, but the linking it has created another sense of urgency to move and to realign incentive at the European level. And at the European Investment Bank, we think that this new renewed leadership of Europe in the green transition is crucial because it provides clarity for all actors in the public and private sector on what is the trajectory that Europe will have in all the policy framework going forward. And the trajectory is clearly a trajectory of faster decarbonization. And this is important because a lot is related to investment. And as we were discussing also before, I think for investment, what you need and absolutely need, both in the private and public sector, is to have a number one, incentives rights. And incentive rights is not only subsidies or a stimulus on the one side, it's really pricing the carbon price right and moving into a proper pricing of emissions. And that's a part of a lot of the proposal also in the Fit for 55 to the extend the ETS system to much more sector and reduce the exemptions that are currently in place. Then it's not only incentives, it's clarity important. And here the experience of Europe is quite crucial because I think we started with something that is very difficult to implement, but is this taxonomy. And having a taxonomy clear and defined, it's complex because having the taxonomy is your tax activities, so then you have to understand if you are a normal person around, you have to understand how these activities relate to the sectors in which you operate, etc. But you come out and it's a complex process, but it's a very important step if you wanted to define a market to say, what are you talking about? So that's the first step. And then you go to forcing and incentivizing, asking for reporting for corporate on their climate risk exposure, on supervisory requirement on the financial sector, on banks and the financial market actor, on what they have to report and how they have to assess the climate risk. And this is coming as well. And the last part is funding. And I think a part of what is important at the European level in this moment is that linking the recovery and resilience, linking the recovery from COVID to the usage of the support stimulus associated to the recovery, this recovery and resilience facility, forcing one part of the expenditure to be related to the climate objective. This brings money quickly on the table that can kick-start activity. But of course, it's not all. And of course, we need much more also to be really catalytic and make sure that private investment follows. If I have still a couple of minutes, I wanted to link to a couple of important concepts. The first one is thinking at the current energy bottlenecks and what they private investment and the trick. On the first point, in Europe, we see the spike in gas prices through the ETS, it reverts in higher energy prices. The first reaction was, we are not ready, we should plug and stop. We have to do is the opposite. We have to even more accelerate the investment in renewable energy and in energy efficiency, something that is at the core of the European decarbonisation strategy. So very strongly push in this direction, but at the same time, creating also these buffers, capacity.
Yeah. Deborah? Yes, the connection is a little... Yes, the connection, it's, you all see the same, yeah? That is a little, it's freeze, yeah? Wes? Okay, yes. Okay, I will come back with her because I think that the three last elements that she mentioned, she couldn't develop well. I will come back with her when she's back with the connection. But maybe I can continue maybe with our second panelist, our Chutinton Kongsak or Sam. We launched early this year an investment policy review of Thailand. We work with many government agencies in Thailand. This is an important part of our process when we do investment policy review and engaging with different agencies. And I have to say that we are especially thank you to you because you really engage in this work with us in the investment policy review. But what I want to ask you is how this review process support Thailand in terms of identifying targeted reform to improve the investment climate and particularly to enable the green growth. Sam, the floor is yours.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I wanted to tell you a personal and down-to-earth, story about how countries engage with OECD, and by way of answering that question, my first exposure to OECD was at the Southeast Asia Regional Program event in Indonesia. And that's where the OECD became non-intimidating, and I like to use the word of, you can sit around a table with much smarter people than you, then the answers are around the table. Or you can sit around a table with less smart people than you, and you can take comfort in knowing that you know more than everyone else. But then, what do you gain, right? So that's how the OECD was introduced into Thailand, and eventually that led to us being the first Southeast Asian country doing the country program with the OECD. And of course, the investment policy review is a compulsory part of the country program, and which will help, the country program meets Thailand's objective of reform. The government, the current government, with an election in between, came with the objective of reform. And I told them that if we do the multidimensional country review, you can be informed about what you need to reform, but also the sequencing. Anyway, so having talked about reform, the OECD is therefore a valuable partner that can move us forward, up the development ladder, right? The phase 1 of our country program, which was recently concluded, covers things like good governance and transparency, business climate and competitiveness, Thailand 4.0, and inclusive growth. But the second part, the phase 2 of the country program, will cover things like business climate and competitiveness, social inclusion and human capital development, sustainable, inclusive, and green growth, and good governance. So, the next phase would come just at the right time. It covers things that we are talking about today, and we've just had COP26, and we have post-COVID recovery to think about. So every country is talking about post-COVID recovery, right? And, we have COP26, and then we have the 2030 SDGs coming up. So OECD's work can really help Thailand and others, navigate through difficult policy decisions to achieve our important goals. For example, some of the useful things that we got from the investment policy review, it identifies priority areas for investment climate reform in support of green, inclusive, and sustainable recovery, and can guide how Thailand can achieve its development ambitions. It's easy for agencies to get into a groove, and a groove becomes a rut. I walked into our Board of Investment office, and I felt that I walked back 20 years in time. So if you don't go outside your comfort zone, and you do the same thing again, like Thailand, we keep breaking our tourist record year by year, then it's easy, just to continue doing the same thing. So the IPR makes recommendations, on investment promotion in green growth, which at the time we did the IPR, it might be something a little bit future, looking, but now it's very timely. And I would like to say it's probably necessary, and it's a boon to us, So we have to, for example, to maximize the effectiveness of efforts to promote green investment, the government should scale down or phase out investment incentives for non-green activities. Often we promote one, but without looking at the other side of the other half, so, and then they cancel each other out. It should also promote targeted financing mechanisms to mobilize financing of green investment beyond the energy sector. A lot of people, when they talk about green, they think about energy, but it's much more than that. I think it's everything. It's everything. So you have to include the green element in everything. And if you start doing that, your targets, your achievements will be much more broader and deeper, and substantial. In this regard, we have been successful in encouraging local banks to engage in green lending for the energy sector. As green finance continues to grow, we look forward to expanding green financing to other targeted areas such as waste, water, and transport, with possible collaboration from the OECD. In addition, IPR recommends establishing a legal system for strategic environmental assessments, which will systematically integrate green considerations to all policy planning and decision-making. In Thailand, green is the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Environment, and that's too narrow. Everyone needs to be having a green element in all of their policies. It's no longer enough for investment to create just wealth and jobs. In the post-COVID-19 recovery, it has to do more to address other objectives. To this end, the OECD's work is critical. for example, your FDI qualities indicators. And what we look forward to next is the FDI Qualities Policy Toolkit. Having the OECD there, as I tell my colleagues, we don't have to pay somebody millions, or even to do the research. We have somebody who already knows. And then the partners, on screen, the EU, we can work, EU can work with ASEAN and so on, So I think COVID has hastened, and has focused, also COP26 and the SDGs has given us a green focus. In addition to the IPR, it's not only the OECD that is our friend. Even before the OECD, we've worked with UNCTAD, to formulate our model treaty for international investment agreements that accommodates policy space for public welfare objectives, including sustainable development. But I think OECD has overtaken UNCTAD a little bit, in terms of being current. And also in Thailand, we have something called the Bio-Circular Green, or BCG economy model. And that's a response to everything that I've mentioned before, sustainable development goals, but also the post-COVID recovery. And since we are chairing APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, next year, 2022, we're trying to mainstream BCG into ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, but also to APEC. And I think working with OECD works with APEC, and OECD also works with ASEAN and the EU, so together, I think we can find a lot of synergy there. I think it offers opportunities, for the OECD to get that, to leverage off the work of these groups. So I think that's all I have to say for now, and we can discuss other things later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Very encouraging your words. That we are also very glad to work with Thailand and with other ASEAN countries and economies. We really learn also a lot from your experience. Deborah, we will come back to you at the end because it's just the last 3 points that you were mentioned that we didn't hear. But let's continue a little with our next and third panelist, Jorge Sequeira. He's not only the director of the Investment Promotion Agency in Costa Rica, but a very active members of our OECD Investment Promotion Agency network. Costa Rica is considered a climate leader, I would say, relying overwhelmingly on renewable energy. In this context, what I want to ask you is what else is CINDE doing in attract private investment that support green growth? And what are the key challenges that IPAs and investors face in this endeavor? But please, Jorge, share your experience because I think that is really interesting.
Oh, hello, Anna. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with such a great group of distinguished panelists. I really enjoyed Sam's methodology of the BCG program that you have in Thailand. I will research into that because and actually you will see it ties in quite well with what I'm going to be talking about. And as you mentioned, Anna, I think that Costa Rica is really a special case, especially in the sense that it is a different case. Why? Because Costa Rica, fortunately, has had a pretty clean electric grid for the last decade or two. In fact, this year already, 99.98% of our electricity has come from clean and renewable sources. And in fact, we have quite a large surplus of clean energy, which I will talk about and how that can help other countries around the world reduce companies reduce their carbon footprint. As you probably know, also, we have nearly 60% of our national territory is covered by forest. In fact, we just won the Earthshot Prize awarded by the Prince of Wales because of that program that completely turned around deforestation. And again, today we have over 60% national territory covered by that. And we host about 6% of the world's biodiversity. So having said that, Our case is different in the sense that we are not right now in the need of attracting what traditionally is considered green investment, mostly around generating clean energy. So where should Costa Rica focus and where should CINDE focus be in order to contribute to carbon neutrality goals for 2050 that we have in Costa Rica, but also helping countries and companies around the world reduce their carbon footprint? Well, we think that focus has to go beyond that green, in our case, beyond that green energy, because we're already there, like I said, and we need to focus in other things like better materials, the circular economy, greener industries, and more. We call this approach the invest with purpose approach. And when we engage companies, we tell them, it's not investing at any cost or anywhere, but it's all about investing with purpose. And you just released a document called, the OECD called, Making Investment Work for Green Growth, the role of FDI. And you mentioned how many companies actually they're offshoring highly polluting activities to other countries from around the world. And obviously we're here in Costa Rica, and it seems that we don't want any part of that. And we focus on this value prop around the people, planet, and I'll focus on that planet and prosperity. And so again, it's not all just about renewables. So from the CINDE perspective, first of all, we have a no chimneys policy. We understand that our role is actually to help Costa Rica continue growing in that path of greener development, greener sustainable development. Towards that end, CINDE has played a very crucial role in Costa Rica's transformation of its economy. And in fact, today, I will mention our two most important sectors, both of them which were led by CINDE's work over the last couple of decades. The first big sector and the number one exporting goods sector in Costa Rica today is the medtech or medical devices sector, which is, like I said, the number one today. We export this year, we will export about $5 billion worth of medical devices and other advanced manufacturing sectors such as electronics and aerospace. And again, these are all no chimneys industrial sectors, but actually the fastest growing employment sector in our country is the knowledge intensive sector, knowledge intensive services sector, is things such as centers of excellence, tech support, IT and IT related services, of which we this year will export about $6 billion worth of that, and that will become the largest sector in Costa Rica. So, these are all sectors where we as CINDE and as a country have focused on towards, converting our economy, which has completely been transformed, from more contaminating or polluting areas in industry and agriculture into these cleaner industries. And that transformation is well in its way and actually continues to grow quite fast. The country, of course, also has policies to support those greener companies. For example, by reducing the tariff of energy for companies that achieve ISO 50001 certifications. We have already over almost 400 multinational companies that we have attracted. It's in the 55 of them have already achieved the certification, and with that they get this prize of getting a price reduction in their bill. From the CINDE perspective, we also target RE or renewable energy 100 companies. There are over 300 of those, which are companies committed to going 100% renewable. So that makes a lot of sense. This is a way Costa Rica can contribute then with these companies and also with other companies by attracting into Costa Rica those operations. And that way, by just plugging into our matrix in terms of their electric consumption, they will be basically a zero carbon footprint. Does this pay off? Yes, it does. Just recently, for example, German company Bayer announced a $200 million investment in one of their most modern plants to be constructed. It's actually being already constructed here in Costa Rica. And beyond talent, which is the main reason they came to Costa Rica, they were very explicit in saying that the reason they came to Costa Rica, the other main reason was Costa Rica's commitment to sustainability and how their own corporate commitment to carbon footprint and other sustainability issues, brought them to Costa Rica in the end. This was a very important part of their decision when they decided where to finally make that site selection decision. We're also working on how to use this surplus that we have of clean energy to actually become an exporter to the world of clean energy. For example, by producing green hydrogen and then exporting that clean hydrogen so that companies around the world can actually benefit from that and reduce the carbon footprint in other parts of the world. We're also looking at how to attract data centers, which, as we all know, consume a lot of energy. So when that energy is produced in other parts of the world where they're very contaminating, well, they can actually come to Costa Rica and again reduce that carbon footprint almost immediately. Again, from Cinda's perspective, we try to attract other green areas, for example, green biofuels and other materials to support decarbonization, and areas such as biomanufacturing, turning agricultural waste into high-value products and energy. And there are several success stories around that. Just as an example, an Israeli company that is actually taking the waste from the pineapple industry, which is very large here in Costa Rica, pineapple sector, which is very large here in Costa Rica. It produces 17 million tons of pineapple waste. Imagine what that does to the environment. Well, we're taking that waste, a part of that waste, and converting it into plant-based leather to produce shoes and purses and all kinds of articles, from this waste. Or a Dutch company that's producing pallets from banana waste. So, doing here this multi-purpose green investment that will help the environment and of course produce better, stronger, more long-lasting materials. And one final example, a French company, well-known, Chanel, which is bioprospecting new materials here in the Nicoya Peninsula, one of the 5 blue zones in the world, and they extract antioxidants from green coffee beans as an ingredient for the blue serum product. So again, these are the types of investments, and I'm running out of time, I'm aware of that. We're seeing this focusing, going greener, going circular, and going carbon neutral. If we have time, then maybe we can elaborate on some other examples later. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Jorge. Don't worry that we will have more time after, but I think that it's good to keep the first intervention like in the way that you keep it. And thanks for reminding us that even though that we are talking a lot about green energy, I think that the attracting green is a broader concept, and I like the way that you present it and framing. Now I would like to move to our representative from business. We have with us Brigitte Hackenstein from BASF. Society, as you know, has now a big expectation regarding the role of business in this endeavor to mitigate and adapt to climate change. For this reason, I would like to ask you, as the representative of one of the largest chemical producers in the world, with production also lines in many parts in the globe, how you could describe in the way that you are doing to decarbonize the investment? What are the main impediments your company face? What are the policymakers that are a lot of participants in this roundtable could help or could contribute to support this business endeavor? Brigitte, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, as a producing company, our key focus is to work hard on fundamentally new low emission production technologies and processes. Well, this is the way we significantly want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we have set ourselves ambitious targets. We want to reduce our absolute CO2 emissions by 25% by 2030 compared to 2018, which in fact means a reduction of minus 60% compared to 1990. And we are committed to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. To do so, we really need fundamentally new processes, how we produce chemicals. For example, we are working on concepts to gradually reduce or replace steam production from our cogeneration plants with heat pumps and steam compressors. We are joining forces also with other companies. For example, with SABIC and Linde, we are working on the first electrical heated steam cracker furnace. Steam cracking is one of the most emitting processes in the chemical industry because you heat fractions of crude oil to about 850 degrees to break down the carbon chains into the basic products for chemical production. And we are working to be able to do this by electricity. in the future. So we are developing the first electrical heating concepts for steam crackers, which in fact would mean that we could completely avoid the emissions from the heating part of the crackers. Another part is producing hydrogen CO2 free. We are exploring different approaches there, for example, electrolysis of hydrogen, but also methane pyrolysis, especially for regions where there is less electricity available, because electrolysis is more electricity intensive than methane pyrolysis. And well, with all these technologies, we in fact would enable to use more electricity, more green electricity also for the production of chemicals then. It's rather clear that the demand for renewable energy is increasing sharply, because it's not only the chemical industry, but also other industrial sectors, or the building sector, and the transport sector especially, who also will need more renewable electricity. So we are strongly advocating to sharply increase the capacities of renewable energy, so that then really these new processes can come into place when we also are ready with our developments. In the moment, we are at the step where the laboratory part is done, where we are on the way to pilot plants, and then the next scaling up will be to big world-scale industrial plants there. But there's also, besides the technological questions, there is also the question of competitiveness. The positive message is technically it is possible to eliminate our CO2 emissions almost entirely. But are these steps economically feasible yet? Well, some measures are already attractive, but others are still very challenging. And we need enabling policies, and especially we need renewable electricity at competitive prices. To help with that, BASF also started to invest in own renewable electricity capacities. We invest in wind parks together with Vattenfall in Netherlands, for example, or with RWE in Germany. But of course, there are still hurdles to be overcome. We need the infrastructure in place, and of course, it also will take enabling regulation to allow for further investments. And what is also an important point is what is accepted as green production, because, as I mentioned, not all of these technologies are competitive yet. We hope that customers will be increasingly willing to pay higher prices for CO2-free production. And of course, we have to develop these markets. That is also another part where we need some support from the political arena. And well, by doing all this, we really hope that we can change the way we produce chemicals in the future. The focus at the moment is mainly on the base chemicals, which is the most energy and also CO2 intensive part in the moment. But of course, we are also looking at the other issues like energy efficiency. In fact, energy efficiency, there are only few potentials left, because the big steps from the start came from improving energy efficiency. Of course, there is still also some potential for using biomass input, and also circular economy, chemical recycling will have to play a role in going toward climate neutrality. But once again, the biggest lever really is shifting to renewable energy, which needs to be available at competitive prices. So I was glad to hear from Costa Rica that they are progressing that well. I think that is one of the key levers for CO2-free production for the chemical industry in the future, to have this, to have infrastructure and also enabling policy which allows for these CO2-free processes to come into the market.
Thanks, Brigitte. Super interesting your intervention to change the process. New processes are needed, and it's hopeful because you mentioned that it's possible. The issue is a little of time and cost, I would say, but just to hear that it's possible. Time is something that is playing against all of us in the climate change battle, but I think that this at least is optimistic in a way. Okay, now I would like right now to introduce Carsten Loeffler. As I mentioned at the beginning, all actors play a role, and researchers who provide evidences and facts are key to mobilize government and business effort to curb climate change. In this context, I would like to ask you, Carsten, how significant is the role of international investors in financing green growth? What are specific challenges faced by green investor? Also, because we are here with policymakers, you can also mention something about the challenges to create this kind of climate for investment to support green growth. Carsten, the floor is yours.
Yeah, many thanks, Anna, and thanks for having me. It's a very important topic that we address today. The significance of the role of international and, let me say, financial investors for financing green growth cannot be underestimated. The potential is certainly huge. We heard about the required investments in sustainable infrastructure, for instance, and then sustainable business practices. So the mentioned 3 trillion plus per annum US dollar, and another figure may be 3 times larger renewable energy sector by 2030. So these are very interesting investment opportunities that certainly won't be covered and can't be covered by public budgets. So it will be very important to mobilize private capital, both in domestic and cross-border investment flows. And in that sense, I'm absolutely with Mr. Mutati from Thailand. We need to approach this with a holistic perspective. So it's not only about renewable energy, it's about the entire economy that is on its transition pathway and already embarked on that. And that is effectively the understanding by financial investors, as well as there's increasing understanding about risks and opportunities in those markets. Discounting those and being required to report on those are key drivers for financial investors. And in particular in the private space, the supervisory authorities play a very important role in them caring for financial market stability on the long term. Asking what happens, what is promoted by the network for greening the financial system by central banks and supervisory authorities, asking all financial institutions to be able to report on climate and sustainability related risks. And what we currently see as specific challenges by green investors, in particular when it comes to cross-border investment, it's still the old question, and we have heard quite a few points already, the old question of risk and return. That needs to be adequate, at least when it comes to the private sector. Public entities might have a little more flexibility, of course, but the bulk of the capital will need to come from private pockets. And in order for that to happen, and that's similar to what Brigitta Huckestein just mentioned is relevant, for instance, for the chemical industry, is relevant as well for private financial investors. It starts with the financial markets, with transparency as well, in order to keep up or to get the required information to actually judge and make informed decisions when it comes to financing and investments. And for that, enabling environments play a key role, in particular when it comes to cross-border investments. And then, so what we have not heard right now, apart from, of course, a price that helps to internalize external effects like a carbon price, there's still FX risks that are very pertinent, and in particular when it comes to some parts of the market, renewables to be mentioned. And sometimes regulatory uncertainty that needs to be overcome. And that's all in your papers in the policy framework for investment with what you published. So it's a permanent effort to get better on that, and to maybe trying to get better on risk sharing between the public and the private sector. And that's what I see as the potential policymakers have. What I observe is that blended finance, though it's a very, very prominent term, is still in its infancy, much under its potential when it comes to risk sharing. And with that, I mean adequate risk sharing, not that the public sector takes all the risks and the private sector takes all the benefits. That's not what I mean. But there's barriers to that, and we looked at that in the German marketplace lately. There's tax barriers, there's regulatory barriers, and scalability is not kind of what is easy to achieve. And in that sense, blended finance seems to be a bespoke solution for very large institutional investors, if all goes well. But not beyond. And this is certainly a big barrier that I can see, and where policymakers might want to address. To finish, I'd like to mention at least 2 points as well, just as a bullet point. Whenever we talk about the transformation, we have to avoid lock-in. So what might be seen as short-term solutions and might be attractive within the next few years might not be so in the long term, and this is very important. And a financial sector's perspective, this is very interesting coming from the European perspective. Now financial institutions will have to publish a green asset ratio, and a green asset ratio is an incentive for financial institutions to compare with each other. And the higher the green asset ratio is, the more attractive maybe such a financial institution might look like. And in that sense, there might be a natural selection bias, slowly but surely over time, for green assets, or at least for assets that are green and or neutral. So with that respect, there is a huge role the financial sector can play as kind of the spider in the web. And in that sense, I would think that putting into place, and that's my bottom line, enabling environments as well that take into account the huge potential of the financial sector in supporting the transition and supporting enterprises, companies in doing so, and that as well on the cross-border basis is very, very important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Karsten. I think that you mentioned this issue of blocking that I was thinking is maybe the last point that the Undersecretary Fernandez mentioned, this issue to keep flexibility in this world of the climate change and measures, because these things change very fast, and things that you think that will be useful at the end are less useful than expected. But this is an important point. Okay, now we will go to our final panelist, Lisa. I would like to introduce Lisa Sachs. She has done a great job from the Columbia Center Sustainable Investment to put this topic I would say, in the core of our agenda from a long time right now. And I would like to ask you, in your research and engagement with policymakers and academics, what is the role of governments in driving the transformation, but not only on national economy, but also regionally? And what do you think, how those pathways will shape investment opportunities that we are discussing right now? Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the kind words, but especially for including me in this incredibly interesting conversation. I have questions and thoughts for each of the panelists, so I look forward to the discussion and to continuing the discussion after the panel with all of you. But I have to say, Anna, I think that the question that you've asked is really important, because unlike the challenge of attracting investment in specific domestic sectors or for certain domestic policy objectives, the challenges of decarbonizing our global economy and of our national and regional energy systems is not primarily a challenge of private sector-led development. It is really at its core a systems challenge, a monumental systems challenge, which all of the panelists individually and collectively, I think, have illustrated. One of the most important reports this year for all of us was the IEA Net Zero Pathways report, which starts the whole report by saying that decarbonization requires nothing short of a total transformation of the energy systems that underpin our economies. And that's to give us even a far shot of staying within safe planetary boundaries. Those necessary transformations are really important, in my view, to emphasize in the context of a discussion on a framework for investment that contributes to a decarbonized global economy. We are not going to get where we need to be if we try to assemble individual investments and to use the tools that we're familiar with from an investment policy perspective. What's needed for this type of systems challenge are national, regional, and global plans that create a robust framework for public and private investment in a coherent and coordinated plan. That's really critical, I would say, for two reasons, if I could just underscore the point. The first is that we are not going to decarbonize the global economy if we take a firm-centric approach. Decarbonization is not going to happen with a series of individual investments or commitments. It requires an intersectoral pathway, again, both at national and, as you rightfully emphasized, at regional scales. Where will the power grid be nationally and regionally? What should be the major energy sources in each national and regional energy mix? What is the role of nuclear? What is the role of offshore energy generation? What opportunities or needs are there for trans-border transmission or distribution? What are the land use needs for storage and transmission, and what are those land use trade-offs? What role is there, as we've heard from our other colleagues, for countries in battery supply chains or in the supply or processing of critical minerals? The value and role of any incremental investment depends entirely on the system as a whole, and we don't have those plans yet. And the second reason that I think it's really important not to take a firm-centric approach to the global energy transformation is that the most decisive levers to achieve decarbonization relate to non-firm specific policies. So the transformation requires a suite of government actions that will decisively create and shift markets. Quantity regulations, land use allocations, mandates and standards for various sectors, transport, buildings, industry, a phase out of combustion engines, public financing for R&D in new critical technologies, massive public outlays and relevant infrastructure, charging stations, distribution, policies to ensure a just transition with training programs and so on. So we are not going to achieve the transformations by approaching certain types of investment piecemeal or in thinking about kind of the general enabling framework or incentives. We need these robust regional pathways and the suite of critical intersectoral government plans, policies, measures, and rules that will create the markets, enable the jobs, create supportive infrastructure, and ensure that the private investors that indeed are absolutely critically needed are contributing to a coherent plan. And by the way, I think just to underscore a really important point that I think Karsten just made, that plan has to include a means for phasing out or transforming relevant capital-intensive assets that already exist in the energy sector, refineries, coal-fired power plants, heavy industrial facilities, pipelines. That IEA report underscores that if today's existing energy infrastructure operated until the end of its lifetime, we will blow past our carbon budget. So our investment policy also needs to account for how to phase out or transition or transform our existing energy infrastructure. And if I can just use the opportunity to underscore one critical point Mr. Mutati made at the very beginning with respect to official financing. These transformations also require substantial public financing alongside an enabling of private finance and investment opportunities, not only in the sense of blended finance, but in terms of financing the public investments that are needed more generally. But despite the many commitments that governments have made, that financing has not been forthcoming. And to the contrary, as Mr. Mutati emphasized, developing countries are facing mounting debt in the face of extraordinary public financing needs, while high-income countries have been able to borrow at extremely low rates, and they have. We heard that from Ms. Rovatella, I believe, in the EU, described a critical financing the EU has been able to mobilize, of course, the US as well, and other high-income countries. But developing countries need fiscal expansion even more than the advanced economies and are facing prohibitively high borrowing costs. So we also need to address this to ensure that this systems approach meets our commitments to official outlays, to ensure that lower income countries can borrow at the same scale and on the same terms as rich countries, and also to meaningfully address the pervasive tax evasion challenges presented by investment flows that are again facilitated and supported by advanced economies. So this is all interrelated. I just wanted to emphasize that point that I think Mr. Mutati really importantly made at the beginning. So let me end here and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lisa. I think that you're completely right. The systemic challenge that we have here is huge, but then it's true that we need to look at it in that way. I would say within each country, this is what we are trying a little to do in the FDI Qualities project, how we link different policies with investment policy within the country, but also, as you mentioned, at the regional, at the national, and then the role of different stakeholders. Yeah, no, this is a systemic challenge. I think that we completely agree with you. Look, we have already some questions and some hands, but I would like to, Deborah, to give you back a little, because we couldn't hear you, the three issues. You said I have three last issues and we couldn't hear. That mean that maybe you can do that or comment something, and then I will open the floor for questions.
Yeah, no, let me, I just, I don't know where you lost me. I just, at a certain moment, everything was disappearing. No, but what I wanted to take actually, part of what I was actually trying to say at the beginning, very much reflect what Lisa was just now saying. And I think the value of the comprehensive approach is really clear on the European point of view. So the fact that having all different elements that have been tackled to really create a systemic transformations, and we see most of these elements that now can come into place, and actually they created incentive also for the private sector to move. And the one thing that I wanted to mention is a little bit an exemplification of this. We run every year a survey of 12,000 firms in Europe, and we also have a benchmark in the US. And we ask to the firms if they perceive physical risk, if they perceive transition risk due to climate change, and then what is motivated, what are the main barriers to their own investment. What you see is that the firms are pretty aware of physical risk. So particularly if they are in sensitive area, they know what a physical risk is, and they know how to deal with that. what they are completely, it's very interesting what happens with the transition risk. On transition risk, what you see is that the firms that are in brown sector recognize it and see it as a challenge. Firms that are in green sectors, they recognize it as an opportunity and they are very much willing to invest catching the opportunities. The problem is that the big chunk of firms, they end up in what we call transition sectors. And in these sectors, they just have no clue what it means, the transition to a green economy for them. They don't know whether it's positive or negative. And the reason is that they just need more capacity to understand to understand what is going to be the transformation. And they are very, very afraid of the uncertainty and uncertainty related to regulation and taxation. And if you ask them, all of the firms, what's the biggest impediment to invest in to deal with the climate transition, they tell you it's uncertainty about regulation and taxation. So until you deal with this and until you do a very clear path of transformation with no return in which you set what the path is, then firms will actually, you will always have at the edge, you will always have those that try to get the positive out of something and those that try to get to cover for the most negatives, but the big of the transformation of the economy will not happen. And that's why it's so important to have this integrated framework in place and very clear long-term direction. The other point I wanted to mention was on innovation. I think a lot is being done to support innovation in green technologies. Again, I suspect that there is this very strong direction at the European level of where the economy will turn is having an impact on a European capacity to innovate on the green side. And the reason why I say it is that we always talk about Europe lagging behind versus US and China on digital innovation in other areas. But when we talk about green innovation, actually Europe is really on top of many of the technologies, growing from everything related to the automotive sector, the electric cars, charging station, but also wind, smart grids, fuel cell, even hydrogen technologies. Europe is patenting more than two times what the US and China are patenting together. So it's really on the lead on these technologies. And I think it's very closely related to this path that is well defined on the policy point of view of where Europe wants to go in the transformation of its economy. And with that, I leave and I will enter in the debate later.
Thanks a lot, Deborah. Okay, very good. First of all, thanks for all your presentation. I think that you are bringing a lot of instructive and rich element to the discussion. We already have some attendees or participants that would like to ask you questions and then a little of questions in the chat. Maybe I can start with Chakifa Dalidei from the Ministry of Industry in France. Shakila, do you want to do the question orally because you have the hands up? Let's see. We can hear your voice. Okay. If not, I have another voice that is Mauricio. Mauricio, can you could you speak or Mauricio Lopez? Let's see.
Here I am. I represent the Argentine Chamber of Exporters, and my question is especially to Jorge Sequeira in Costa Rica. Good morning, Jorge. I wonder whether you have experience in modern bioenergy, especially regarding agriculture and ganadería. Sorry for my Spanish. Do you have experience there regarding biodigesting?
Yes, Mauricio, thank you for your question. Good morning to you as well. In fact, I am not an expert in that topic by any means, but yes, actually, this is something that has been growing quite fast here in Costa Rica. We do have a very large agricultural sector as well as cattling, which you were asking. And so you see these biodigesters at a very micro level, independent farms installing these biodigesters all around the country. But you also see them at a larger scale. There are examples, for example, and I personally visited plants, orange processing plants for orange concentrate production, which process millions of oranges per day. They have installed this massive biodigester systems, to obviously convert that methane into energy. The same, I personally visited a plant in the south of the country, which works or produces African palm oil. And again, they made a massive investment in a biodigester, huge biodigester, which, by the way, they pay themselves in under 3 years. So this is the type of investments that really makes sense for companies. They're helping the environment, and at the same time, of course, it makes a lot of business sense, because after it pays for itself in 3 years, then after that, it's all goes to the bottom line. There's one final case I can mention, the Earth University, which focuses on sustainable agriculture careers. Of course, to set the example, they have installed biodigesters, which have reduced their energy consumption by something like 30%. So I think these are all examples, Mauricio, and we can touch base offline. I hope I answered your question, although I am not by any means an expert on the topic.
You did. Thank you very much, Jorge. And probably one of the most important things is the capture of methane, that powerful greenhouse gas emitted. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mauricio. Let's now answer one of the questions of the chat. Maybe, Karsten, you can help us with this. This said, what were the responses of existing foreign investment to the changes in new policies in moving toward greener growth? And where there are any specific industry that found changes to be more difficult than others?
Yeah, I can respond to the first part in particular. As a general remark, what we see with financial investors is that there is much more sensitivity as to what's getting financed, and that the due diligence processes are about to get. It's at different levels. Some are more advanced, some less, but it tends to get to the next level to understand what actually is going to be financed. And that relates in particular for those operating out of the European Union to the European taxonomy, in order to understand, if the assets that are going to be financed would qualify for being green. So that's what we certainly see. And again, it's related as well to supervisory authorities' expectations in terms of managing climate and sustainability related risks, meaning that understanding climate related risks of any investment is of the essence. So it's no way without going forward.
Okay, thanks a lot, Karsten. Lisa, there is one question that is a little complex in a way because it's relative, but it's the idea of the dispute claims against the state. There is a question that said that there are risks with certain incentive to bring in greener investment into state, for example, tax or financial incentive. If the state in 5 years draw back or reduce such incentive, and then the question is if there is risk that this investor will raise a claim. I can imagine that depend on the investment, but in the investment agreement. But please go ahead if you can answer that.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's a very relevant question because we've already seen such claims. The way I would reframe the question is to note that we have seen claims challenging all sorts of measures that governments have taken in line with their commitments under the Paris Agreement, in line with their commitments to achieve sustainable development goals, and so on. So indeed, incentives or other measures that we've discussed to attract investment, are as at risk of being challenged as any others. But I think it's really important to reflect on the implication of that. It's certainly not that governments should refrain from taking these absolutely necessary measures. It's that we should ensure that we are supporting an international governance system that enables governments to take these necessary steps, and that gives governments the regulatory space and the flexibility to evolve their policies over time, because that's absolutely what's needed by these urgent and evolving challenges. So yes, I think that there's a risk. It's not specific to incentives. We are increasingly seeing a number of important measures challenged, and we really should reflect on the way that we support governments in implementing these important regulations and ensuring that they are not subject to such challenges.
Thanks, Lisa. Good answer. Look, I have another participant, and maybe you can raise because I think that your questions are in the chat, but Zoe Luxon, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Anna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Zoe Luxon. I work at Anima Investment Network. Our network promotes sustainable economic development in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and in the MENA region. And so my question is also for Lisa Sachs. You mentioned the systematic change needed, and I wanted to know who are the right stakeholders? Should that be national governments or rather global stakeholders? And which one? Is it institutions, the United Nations, or non-governmental actors? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. For such a systems challenged, we need all. We need, and I think we really, and OECD and UNCTAD and other of our partners have all written in different ways on the systemic, or the role of each of these institutions in addressing these systemic challenges. I think briefly what I would say is that, well, first let me just underscore that there really is a role for each. The IEA's pathway was a decisive contribution to all governments and to all stakeholders and to all sectors in illustrating what pathway is possible. We need governments to take the lead. Absolutely. We need governments to be, first of all, adapting the global pathways to their own national pathways, because each country has different contexts, different energy mix, different sectors, and so on. So we need that to happen at the national level. And we need regional and global cooperation, not only because energy systems are regional, but also because, as we've discussed, the financing mechanisms, which are critical, have global implications. The financial architecture has global implications. Supply chains are global. So I do think that it's governments that need to lead, but with the support of a number of different institutions that can provide invaluable support on the science and the science-based pathways, on the institutional capacity building, which I know a number of our government policymakers both have benefited from, panelists, have benefited from and have called for, that we need more institutional capacity at the national levels to be able to adapt these, the global pathways to the national level. So I think that would be my short answer, is governments absolutely in the lead, institutions providing the support and the guidance. And by the way, companies not standing in the way, because that is happening. It's absolutely happening in our country, in the US. We have just seen bold climate action that is being dismantled because of lobbying and special interests. So we also need companies to stand out of the way as our policymakers set the pathways.
Okay, thanks a lot, Lisa. Brigitte, I will give you the floor to you to answer, but also because I want to ask a question to both of you. That means that you can also, Sam and Brigitte, because I want to take advantage also to having the government and the business experience here, and particularly about the public-private dialogue, because we know that here is very important. We have talking about the systemic challenges and then the contribution of different parts, but how you ensure that this collaboration could foster this green growth? That means that maybe, Brigitte, you can start complementing whatever you want to say, but also tell me about this kind of public-private relationship dialogue to make the contribution to the green growth, and then I will give you the floor to Sam. And Deborah, maybe you can thinking about the chat. There is a question that I'm sure that Deborah you could answer from France. But Brigitte, first you.
Actually, I wanted to comment on companies standing in the way, because my understanding really is it is, of course, a task of companies and policymakers to work together and to find some outcome-oriented positive regulations which also preserve international competitiveness, because this international competitiveness issue is often an issue which seems to be the argument to be in the way. But of course, a company has to find solution how it can be competitive, how it also can bring these new technologies in the market while still being able to earn money and further develop these technologies. And it's also clear that no company alone can achieve the climate goals. It is a question of collaboration along the value chains, and that needs political support. I also see a strong role for governments, but I also see a much stronger need for governmental collaboration between different regions, between different countries, to allow for a level playing field for industry. It must not be the same type of policies, but we need a playing field which is much more level between at least G20 countries, than to also allow the new technologies to come into the market. And it's sometimes it is that we have the feeling that also the governments are not consequently allowing for these enabling technologies. Of course, it's depends on national specific situations, infrastructure, the type of industry being in that country, and so on. But that is, I think it doesn't help to push responsibilities like it's the companies who don't want this regulation, it's the government who is not playing its role, but it has to be, I think it has to be mentioned somewhere, it has to be something like a global road book where industry has to go. As I mentioned, we are developing the technologies of these. Of course, these technologies then also tell what exactly is needed to bring these technologies into reality. And this has to go together, and it does not help to single out sectors to say that they are not working the right way, but it is collaboration really between all market participants, between the society as a whole, and also, of course, also between governments and policymakers.
Yes, thanks, Brigitte. This is collaboration is the word. I agree with you. It's not just your business responsibility; it's a mix of different responsibilities at the same time. Sam, you want to also comment on that? I think that your view will be very interesting.
Sure. So having listened to everyone, I think broader is better. Broader meaning national level. Regional, global is probably more effective, than what we're doing at the moment. Okay, that's one. In Thailand, we include environment and and greening as part of something businesses do, you know, it's to add to their green credentials and so on and so forth, you know. So up to this point, we had been proud of the fact that we are the first Asian country to adopt a national action plan on business and human rights. See, and the human rights aspect also covers things like community, land, natural resources, environment. Okay, and in Thailand we also have a Thailand's chapter of the UN Global Compact Network, which was formed since 2016 with 80 leading Thai multinational companies. They do good things, but my takeaway from what we've discussed is that I have to push for something that is national, regional, and then participate in something global, and that would be more effective. The other thing that I'm hearing a lot, not from the seminar, but from my seniors and people who've moved around, is that there seems to be in their perception, a lot of green financing available. That's a good thing, you know, and maybe it will not be enough, it doesn't matter, but what we should do is to make the best use of what is available. So I think there's a lot of room for cooperation there, and there are people that understand things better than others, you know. Costa Rica seems to be very advanced, you know. Then around our neighborhood, there are people that are behind us, people that are ahead of us. So there's room for us all to work together, because, you know, borders are, I mean, there's no screen that we can put up like in COVID, you know, between countries and so on. So that's what I wanted to say. I have some work to do after this.
Thanks a lot, Sam. I like this. It's true that we are also understanding that the issues are national, global, regional, and global, and the issue that you just mentioned in terms of working together. Deborah, I think that our French participants, the Minister of Industry, the question is that can we really succeed in green investment after the COVID in terms of public and private financing and incentive policies, but by OECD and EU organization, but maybe you can deal with the EU part.
Yeah, I think what we see, and I maybe speak a little bit out of what's the experience that we have seen. We are seeing it now at the European level. So the linking the recovery part with the green transition in Europe comes mostly with this program that is the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where a big chunk of the resources is actually being tied to be associated to projects that need to be aligned to climate action and environmental sustainability. This was the first time that at the European level you had a huge counter-cyclical crisis-related public provision of grants to European member states, and partly grants and partly loans, but with the direction of having one component that was related to climate. What we see in the implementation phase, the member state had to provide a plan. They are being now slowly deployed. But what we see is that one of the biggest constraint also in the public sector is really the technical capacity of implementing whatever we are already doing at the European level in terms of regulation, taxonomy, definitions, the new programs, etc. But really to have all this knowledge in the public sector, and also being able to coordinate and generate a project in this direction. So the creation of a kind of a project list that makes sense and is coherent at the European level. So at the end, what we see is that at the public sector point of view, technical capacity and green technical capacity is missing and is quite important. It's important at the local level. We know it at the cities, municipality level. The technical capacity and knowledge and capacity to deal with the green transition is something still very much lacking, where not a lot of effort has to be put in place. And that's quite important because you need this, and then you need it also in the private sector. So it's really my main concern in many of the discussion that I'm hearing, and I very much follow what was just said, that there is a finance available. The problem is really to bring the projects on the plate, particularly to projects that make a systemic transformation in the public sector. And then you will have also projects coming also from the private sector accompanying it.
Thanks, Deborah. I think that there is an issue and a topic on the project that you mentioned. There is a question in the chat that maybe I will put it here, but I want to, because we are running a little long time, because we need to also do some closing remark by our chairman. But there is a question about in the chat about if it's better for domestic authority to be given full authority into deciding the standard, or what green investment project would be aware financial assistance, or will be some harmonization cooperation with regional area. This is a question, of course, a little, if you're a European country, will be a question for you, Deborah, but I think that probably is beyond that in a way we are talking here exactly about the regional, the global, the better, but at what level and who. Maybe let's see if we can answer that before leaving, but I don't want to, I would like to give the floor to one participant that raised his hand. It's Luc Lapointe. Maybe you can make your question orally first. Luc.
Thank you, Anna, for giving me this opportunity. And just to pick up on the words of Deborah, when it comes to connecting this global liquidity of money that we know exists, and the needs and opportunities in communities. What we found, I mean, some of the discussion we're having at Concordia, and we're having with Standard & Poor and the Emerging Market Investor Alliance, is the lack of credit rating, right? So even if you have all the money in the world, what will make the money possible at the end to get to these communities is having a good rating, or some kind of a ratings that will make that connection between liquidity and the needs and opportunities. So some of the discussion we're having with the likes of Standard & Poor right now is, can we come with some kind of hybrid ratings, that would not affect sovereign ratings, but would allow to give enough confidence for investors to make that money available to connect to the needs of these communities. So I don't know if it's some of the things that you started to look at when it comes to, I said, the problem is not liquidity and the problem is not needs, but what makes the money connect with these communities is basically that credit rating, or the rating that will make it possible, which we know there's a big knowledge gap. There's a big rating gap, right, in emerging economies. It's hard to find that credit rating at the sovereign level, yes, but at the subnational, it's almost impossible. And closing that gap would take forever. So I don't know if it's some of the issues that you start looking at. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks to you, Luc. Deborah, I will give you the floor to you, and then I will move this panel to the closing remark. Deborah.
I think, I think this is an interesting idea to have ratings. The concern that I have is still that we need to have the overall framework clear. And if you think at what I was mentioning before, if by now firms don't know what the climate transition, a big chunk of firms doesn't know what the climate transition will generate to them, whether it will be a risk or an opportunity. I think the giving ratings is complicated, because you first need to have the full set of information, even the understanding of the firms being done. So it comes even before a rating. I think the full clarity on what is the path and how the path will affect different counterparts, and then you can have the rating. The rating tends to be something that now shows the virtues of firms, but it doesn't show the risk exposure yet. And I think we have to be careful on how we use them. But it's one tool. I think the most important one still remains the full understanding and disclosure at the firm level on the exposure of the risk.
Thanks, Deborah. I think that we are running out of time, and of course, I don't want to take more than the 2 hours of the time of you and the participants. But first, let me thanks all the participants for sharing your views. I think that you really enlighten all of us in terms of the broader view and the different view depending on the stakeholder. But Manfred, our chair of the investment committee, maybe allow me to give you the floor to draw some conclusions and maybe some closing remarks before we finish this panel. Manfred, the floor is yours. We can hear you, Manfred. No. Let's see. No? No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
I'm sorry. I did nothing except muting myself and unmuting myself afterwards. So why it has not worked, I don't know. Great, it did. Let me start by thanking Secretary General Matthias Cormann, Under Secretary Jose Fernandez, Minister Felix Mutati, Deputy Permanent Secretary Shutinton Kongsak, and all speakers for their excellent and inspiring remarks, and all participants from governments, the private sector, international organizations, civil society and academia, as well as the colleagues from the OECD Secretariat for their engagement and contributions to today's fourth roundtable on investment and sustainable development. I think today's discussion could not have been more timely. And it proved once again the potential of the roundtable as a generator of fresh and innovative ideas necessary for addressing the immense challenges the investment community is dealing with. And of course, in particular, climate change, which constitutes an unprecedented challenge for the future of our planet and for humanity. Under Secretary Fernandez said that climate change undermines everything we have been fighting for in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and no country, rich or poor, will be spared. I couldn't agree more with this point. Today's roundtable underscored that foreign direct investment can and has, and I want to stress this, can and has to make a crucial contribution to the decarbonisation of our economies, and as the OECD Secretary General put it, stronger, cleaner and fairer growth. Let me just reiterate a few data points that were mentioned. In both advanced and developing countries, FDI has shifted considerably away from fossil fuels and into renewables. In the OECD, renewables accounted for 90% of energy FDI in 2020. Also last year, a third of new global investments in renewable energy were FDI. On the other hand, the investment gap continues to widen, as has been mentioned. The International Energy Agency estimates that investments into renewables need to triple by 2030 in order to successfully curb climate change. And in addition, green growth requires the greening of investments beyond the energy sector. 70% of greenfield FDI flows continue to be in non-energy sectors that are responsible for the bulk of global FDI emissions. Several speakers underlined that foreign direct investment contributing to green growth relies on fair, transparent, and predictable regulatory frameworks, such as those advocated by the OECD Policy Framework for Investment. I was really thrilled to hear from Permanent Secretary Shutintorn Kongsak that the recent investment policy review of Thailand based on this framework has helped Thailand to identify policy options for attracting new investments that bring in the technologies and qualities required for the green transition. But the discussion also confirmed that open, transparent, and non-discriminatory policies, while being necessary, are not sufficient. Efforts to mobilize necessary investments have to be aligned with efforts to optimize their impact. Fully realizing the potential benefits from FDI depends on the right policies and institutional arrangements being in place. I'm proud that the OECD Investment Committee that I'm chairing is committed to support governments in their efforts to target and improve the impact of FDI on sustainable development, including on decarbonisation and green growth. The Investment Committee's OECD FDI Qualities project, mentioned several times today, is designed to assist governments in enhancing the qualities of FDI and optimizing their impact on inclusive and sustainable development. After 3 years of hard work and intense discussions, including today's roundtable, the committee endeavors to deliver a groundbreaking FDI qualities policy toolkit at next year's OECD Ministerial Council meeting. With this outlook, I'd like to conclude by thanking you on behalf of the Investment Committee and the OECD Secretariat for participating in today's session, and by calling on all of us to further intensify our joint efforts to accelerate green investment and to engage in the investment policy changes necessary to successfully address the climate crisis. Because, to paraphrase Robert Frost, we have promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. Thank you.
Very good, Manfred. With these last sentences, we are ready to close this panel. Thanks a lot, all of you. I would like also to thank Iris and Martin, because they really did a good job in the background, all this roundtable. Angel, Ines, Kanye, our assistant, the interpreters, and the IT support. Thanks, panelists, again, and hope to see you soon, maybe next year in person in Paris. Okay? Enjoy the rest of the evening. Bye.